Hello everyone, welcome back. Let's continue discussing country risk analysis, but with a new focus. So far we have discussed various components of country risk, such as macroeconomic and financial risk, including debt crisis and exchange rate volatility. But in country risk assessment and management, political risk is probably the most intriguing and exciting issue. Why, how, and when does a country fall in socio-political turmoil? When does social frustration lead to tensions, and tensions to crisis, and crisis to violence, and sooner or later, a revolution? Well, political risk is the unexpected consequences of the arbitrary exercise of power by a government and its ramifications at home and abroad. That means that political risk is not the monopoly of foreign bankers or foreign investors. Think of people living in Venezuela today, or in Turkey, or even in the US. They also face political risk. Well, this is not new. Virtue, ethics, and governance have been discussed, debated, and analyzed since the Middle Age and the Renaissance in the 15th century. In the city hall of Siena in Tuscany, there is a 14th century picture that invites governments and policymakers to strike a delicate balance between justice, wisdom, and strength. This is still up to date, indeed. In the mid-19th century, in London, at the time of the Industrial Revolution, Marx analyzed the process of economic change and class struggle leading to violence and revolution. And according to Marx, capitalism is inherently unstable. It produces growing wealth gaps, and it will inevitably lead to increases in class polarization and class conflict. Daniel Bell is widely known in the US and acclaimed for his book, The Cultural Contradiction of Capitalism. He analyzes the endogenous instability in modern capitalism due to the polarization and social tensions between work and consumption pressures, as well as the mounting frustration due to income gaps and wealth gaps. Ulrich Beck is a German sociologist. He died in Berlin in 2015, and he wrote The Risk Society in 1986, where he analyzes rising risk due to technology, innovation, and globalization. This is the World Risk Society, full of hazards and insecurities induced by modernization itself. Well, looking at the number of risks reported by the FTSE 100 companies today in 2017, as you can see, political risk and terrorism are widely considered as the most dangerous and hence the top priorities. Well, we look now at the major concern of investors in emerging market countries reported by the World Bank's IFC. We do not find access to financing or problems of market opportunities, but clear-cut risk of political instability. This is the overwhelming risk for FDI, foreign direct investment. And within this range of political risk, what do we find in the mind of investors? Not terrorism, but breach of contracts, regulatory changes, and convertibility restrictions. Currency restrictions can include capital controls, illiquidity, reduced transparency, high volatility of exchange rate, and changing regulatory framework. Using financial instruments to hedge foreign exchange risk may or may not be possible in many countries. Same story in Africa, the so-called continent of the 21st century, where the truth is that Africa has a tremendous potential, which is mainly a potential. The continent's share of global FDI capital flows reached 11% in 2016, according to Ernst & Young, but the key impediment, the key obstacle to continued growth and development is political instability. In fact, clearly in Africa, socio-political tensions are the main obstacle to large and growing FDI. Though Chinese investors tend to take a very long-term position with ongoing patience, foreign investors tend to gravitate mainly towards 6 countries that account for nearly 60% of total FDI. But in the fall of 2017, turbulences in Kenya and Egypt might reverse the trend. So it's not surprising that FDI is still modest and with ups and downs in Africa, looking at the homicide rate, with the exception in the north of Maghreb countries. Well, the question is, what are the main signals of political upheaval in order not to be caught off guard? Well, looking at the 2014 revolution in Ukraine, as we see on the chart, there is a clear and abrupt increase in bond yields, both in the short-term 6-month yield and in the 2-year bond. And in 2017, bond yields have not dropped very much due to the geopolitical tensions between Ukraine and Russia, with yields still around 15%. But this is in fact the consequence of political upheaval. We don't have any early warning signals ahead of the abrupt country risk worsening. The cost of political risk is very large for investors, for banks, for insurance companies, and also for domestic residents. At the global level, according to the World Economic Forum, the cost of global violence reaches nearly $14 trillion per year, the equivalent of 13% of global GDP. The World Economic Forum methodology for accounting for the economic impact of violence and conflict is based on 16 separate categories of violence, conflict, and public and private expenditures to contain violence. The total economic impact of violence on the world economy in 2015 was estimated to be 14 trillion in purchasing power parity. That's the equivalent, as I said, to nearly 14% of world GDP, or roughly $1,900 per annum per person. That's a very large cost. There are many ways to measure political risk, including wars, strikes, crimes, and also kidnapping, of course. If you are a manager or a country risk analyst working in Mexico or in Venezuela, you know, that's the most recent kidnap review map provided by NYA, the insurance company. This world map is the latest political risk map provided by the global insurer AON. And as you can see, there is a clear and darker picture in the African continent. But we can also be surprised by the same level of risk, according to AON, between France and Morocco, as well as between Spain and the US. So these country risk maps are interesting, but must be taken with a grain of salt. There's a large number of indicators in this peace index, including political violence, crimes, terrorism, and military regimes. Iceland remains the most peaceful country on earth, a position it has held since 2008. It is joined at the top of the index by New Zealand, Portugal, Austria, and Denmark in Scandinavia. Finally, this risk map gives you a glance at a number of hotspots in the world regarding wars and armed conflicts, declared formal or not. And indeed, in a large number of countries, there is still military conflicts. Finally, let's look at a map which is supposed to anticipate and to project the upcoming spots of political tension and crisis. This map is of 2010, and as you can see, it did not include any of the hotspots, including the Arab Spring in Tunisia or in Egypt, the revolution in Syria, or the upheaval and the revolution in Ukraine. So once again, these political maps are interesting, but let's take them with a little bit of caution. Political risk is a byproduct of the overall uncertainty that stems from the arbitrary exercise of power by a government, not only a foreign government, but also the government that can generate risk for domestic residents. Think of Turkey, of Catalonia in the fall of 2017, Venezuela, and Myanmar. Now, the impact and consequences of political risk are many. Think of capital controls, expropriation, nationalization, strikes, kidnapping, and terrorism. What we can do is to distinguish three main sources of political risk, namely direct, such as expropriation, indirect, strikes or bureaucracy, and collateral. Collateral means that the investors are not a specific target of hostile intentions, but they suffer from unfavorable interactions between power groups, for instance, unions or NGOs. Now, if we look at the root causes of political risk, there are many. And they can stem from ethnic tensions, wealth gaps, social frustrations, power struggles, or guerrilla, think of Colombia, and of course also from religious radicalism. Well, Samuel Huntington analyzed the process of political crises in the so-called rapidly changing societies, and mainly in the so-called process of modernization. That means that a society goes through a number of changes, including in work, in economic structures, in cultures, in political systems, and in values. According to Huntington, violence will stem from a gap or a lag between two transformations. The process of socio-economic modernization is not matched by a process of political and institutional modernization, with political institutions capable of managing the stress of modernization. Hence, the result is violence. Think of rapidly changing socio-economic structures in emerging market countries, in China, in Brazil, or in Ivory Coast, when the economic system changes more rapidly than the institutional and political system. And that gap produces tensions, frustrations, and tensions can produce violence and repression. One can use this simple graph to map out and to illustrate the tensions produced by the gap between the process of socio-economic change and that of political change. And as you can see, that gap leads to a repressive regime to enforce, to impose social stability. Now, there are many examples of the consequences of this gap in the process of modernization. Think of China, Tiananmen, of Tunisia, the Jasmine Revolution, of Myanmar, and of Turkey in 2017. But sometimes, policymakers recognize the danger of this gap between institutional and socio-economic changes. Institutions, in fact, provide channels of expression of social demands. And when these channels do not exist, or they are slow to develop, or they are still weak, violence will emerge. As former Prime Minister of China Wen Jiabao observes, political reform is a necessary companion to economic modernization. Otherwise, again, violence will emerge. That observation by the Chinese Prime Minister is also well summarized by Chile's President Michelle Bachelet. When structural economic reforms are not accompanied by the necessary social policies, well, poverty and social injustice become time bombs. So to sum up, economic growth is not enough for a smooth and inclusive process of modernization. What is crucial is to transform economic growth into sustainable development, which means economic growth, of course, but coupled with education, social justice, health, and a process of socio-political mobilization that can be described as democracy. Otherwise, political risk will increase. Thank you.